Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this A2i talk. The topic of today's talk is sustainability, a topic that I believe that many of us find important and relevant, either from the perspective of how we address it, but also how we measure sustainability. At the same time, it's a very complex topic, and therefore I am happy to have Christian Sloth from Preferred by Nature with us. Christian has played a key role in developing sustainability frameworks for the forestry and agriculture sector. And I hope we can get a good discussion going on some of the prospects and challenges in using these frameworks. So Christian, thank you for helping us with this.
Thank you.
As for the format of today, we will start with a 20 to 25 minute presentation from Christian, followed by 20 minutes where you can ask questions. These questions you can either pose in the chat, or you can raise your digital hand, or just simply interrupt once we get to that part of the session. I should also say that we are recording the session, which will be available for streaming on our website after today. So that is it from my side. Let me hand over the screen to you, Christian, and once again, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Could you please all mute yourself? There's a lot of noise.
Yeah.
Thanks. All right. Thank you. Well, my name is Christian. I work for Preferred by Nature. I have a background in forestry primarily, and have worked for almost 10 years in international forestry management and forest certification. I'm going to talk today a little bit about the work that my organization, Preferred by Nature, is doing related to the new and coming EU deforestation regulation, and then our response to sustainability requirements by the industry, our sustainability framework. So just very briefly about who Preferred by Nature is. Sorry, I was starting the wrong way. We are an international not-for-profit organization. We have an origin in Denmark, but is now an international organization with more than 300 staff on all continents, working broadly within sustainability, forestry, agriculture projects, and so on since the mid-90s. We work within different areas with sustainability. We have several mission-driven projects where we implement different types of solutions for sustainability with local people. We also have a lot of activities with certification services primarily for forestry and agriculture. But we also have a tourism standard where we certify sustainable tourism. We do a lot of training and capacity development, and we also have support services directly where we act as a consultant or an advisor to industry and farmers and foresters to implement their sustainability goals. So we are a mission-driven organization, and this is also what we have built our sustainability framework on, is our mission to support better land management and business practices in order to benefit people, nature, and the climate. So our sustainability framework is a standard that includes all these aspects of sustainability, a comprehensive definition of sustainability. The vision of the idea with developing the sustainability framework was from the beginning to try to achieve our own framework, which would cover different steps in the supply chain and different actors in supply chains, from the land use level activities through manufacturers, traders, and retailers, and also to investors, banks, or financial institutions investing in land use operations, with the aim of ensuring sustainability for their activities. In Preferred by Nature and also with our sustainability framework, we primarily work with these priority commodities, but in principle, we could work with any agricultural forest commodity. The framework is adaptable to be applied for any commodity. And use those commodities here, or products with a small EU flag on, are those that are covered or included in the EU deforestation regulations. So these are the products that will be regulated by the deforestation regulation once it becomes enforced. And that is, we assume that will happen very soon. It has been approved politically, but it's running through the processes of the final polishing before the EU will publish it in their official journal. So in terms of the application of our sustainability framework, a sustainability standard, like we are working with many other certification systems, we can use our framework as a normal product certification standard, where we would go to the farm or the forest, here to the left. We would then certify the product, which would then go through the supply chain, through transport, processing, to the final users of the shop, and be applied on that a chain of custody standard or a traceability system to trace the product and the claim through the supply chain, like we know from other existing certification systems. But we also allow the use of a risk-based due diligence process with our framework, so with the basis in our definition of sustainability. A company downstream, the end user or a manufacturer downstream in the supply chain, can implement a risk-based due diligence system using our standards and the framework to look upstream in the supply chain to assess the risk that the sustainability practices are not meeting the desired standards. So for implementation of our sustainability framework program, we have a full range of standards that are applicable to different types of activities by different actors in the supply chain. We have the sustainability framework itself. I'm going to come back a little bit to that. And we have system requirements, which is like the quality management system requirements. We have a standard for due diligence system implementation. We have a chain of custody and traceability, and we have a claims and seal use standard. So the sustainability framework is a core document. This is where we outline and define what sustainability is for us. And as I mentioned before, it consists of 4 principles on management and business practices. It's people's well-being and human rights, nature and environment, and then also the climate. So I would say that an important attribute of the sustainability framework is that we have combined the normal sustainability aspects like nature, environment, people, human rights, and legality of production or processing with the climate aspect. As you probably know, there are many sustainability standards for the different commodities, and there are many climate or greenhouse gas emission standards out there. We are trying to combine those into one framework that can address a multitude of different commodities while also addressing the climate aspect. This is just an overview. I'm not going to go into detail here of the different criteria that's included in the framework. And as I just said, the application of the framework is flexible, meaning that we have our global framework for sustainability, and it can be applied through different adaptations and revisions based on the commodity, the country, and the risks in the specific country or where the product has been sourced from. So it's a very flexible system that can be used for many different applications. We provide different types of verification services, land use verification, verification of processing, due diligence verification. We apply our verification as an add-on to existing certification if you want an umbrella framework to encompass different types of existing certifications, for example, in a complex or combined product with different types of commodity certifications for the different ingredients. We also have our chain of custody and our greenhouse gas emission compensation. So another important point, I just touched on that before, is that we recognize the assurance that's provided by existing or other types of certification schemes. And what we will do is that we will conduct a benchmarking process where we will evaluate other third-party schemes against our sustainability framework. And we can, through that process, recognize those efforts and certify products or parts of products that with certified contents under one scheme. An important development, as I mentioned, that has recently happened or has happened over the last couple of years is the formulation and very soon implementation of the EU deforestation regulation. This is something we have thought into the sustainability framework and aligned our framework with the requirements of the EU deforestation regulation, meaning that we can provide a verification service that will be aligned with the requirements of the EU deforestation regulation, both for companies that are importing into the EU market and is liable for the implementation of the requirements, but also to producers outside the EU that are exporting to the EU market in order for them to support their buyers inside the EU market to meet these requirements. Very briefly on this, the regulation. As a regulation, the regulation is the highest level of legal instrument that the EU have. That means that once the regulation is published, it becomes immediately law for all the member states. So the member states are obliged to implement the actual text of that regulation. So it's quite an important piece of legislation that will affect companies that import or sell to the EU market the commodities that I mentioned before, cattle, timber, coffee, tea, palm oil, soy, and natural rubber. So quite a diverse range of products and also derivatives of those commodities, which is found in a lot of different products that we use in our daily lives. The key components of the regulation is that it places a prohibition on operators. Those are the companies that place these commodities on the EU market. So it places a prohibition for importing or export of those products if they do not comply with the requirements. I'm coming back to the requirements in the next slide. There's a due diligence obligation, meaning that operators of companies in the EU have to implement a due diligence system to manage risk. There are also specific obligations on the member states to ensure implementation and enforcement. And to support this whole thing, the EU will develop and implement a information system where all companies that place these products or products that are covered by the regulation will have to upload information on their due diligence system. So as I said, the commodity scope quite broad. We have beef, coffee, cocoa, palm oil, rubber, soy, wood, and derived products such as leather, chocolate, a lot of different derivatives of palm oil, and also a lot of different derivatives of soy. There is a defined scope in the annex to the regulation. So for the specific obligations of operators, so if you're an organization that import or export any of the products that are covered that I just showed, there is an obligation. You cannot do that according to the regulations. They are confirmed to be deforestation free, and they are produced in accordance with relevant legislation in the country of production, and they are covered by a due diligence statement that has been uploaded to the information system. Also, that's a requirement that operators, companies, exercise due diligence through a approved systems and procedures. I'm not going to go into details here, but if you are going to evaluate what deforestation is, or deforestation free is, you have to understand how this is defined in the regulation. But it's defined by different various changes to the structure of forests. As for the legal requirements, the risk assessment that's incorporated in the due diligence obligation have to include evaluation of the risk of non-compliance in the country of production against these types of legislation. So we have land use rights, environmental protection legislation, forest-related regulations for timber products, labor rights, human rights, third parties' rights, the principle of free, prior, informed consent, and then also tax, anti-corruption, and trade and customs regulations. So quite a broad range of different legal aspects that have to be included in the risk assessment. The due diligence obligation includes that operators that import or export these commodities have a system in place where they can assess and mitigate any potential risks, and they have to upload a due diligence statement to the information system that's available to competent authorities before the products or commodities can be placed on the EU market or exported from the EU market. So that means that the due diligence process in principle has to be conducted prior to the import or export. As I said, we have aligned our sustainability framework with the EU deforestation regulation, and we have published our interpretation of these legal categories and the deforestation categories with some more detail than just these broad categories. Just in order to prepare for the regulation, this is probably going beyond what I have in time.
Still have some time, that's okay.
It's just for those companies that are placing on the market or exporting from the EU market. If you're an operator, you should start prepare for this regulation now. There will be an 18-month implementation period before the competent authorities are supposed to verify compliance. So that will be maybe in a year or a little less from now. These requirements will be applicable. So it's if that process has not started yet, operators or companies that are defined as operators in the regulation should start to understand the requirements and also to evaluate the level of readiness and look at supply chains, look at the risks of deforestation, understand the origin of materials, and so on. So there's a lot of actions that can be taken for those who are operators. If you are in the supply chain, you engage with downstream buyers and EU buyers. If you are, producers on the other hand that are exporting to the EU, should also ideally begin preparing for this to make available data on legality, deforestation issues, and origin data to their buyers inside the EU. Very briefly, the last part is that we allow the clients that have been verified against our sustainability framework and also against the requirements for the EU deforestation regulation to communicate this to their buyers or clients through the use of our seal on product, which will require full conformance with all the sustainability framework requirements, plus carbon footprint compensation, or only off-product logo use where specific requirements of the framework has been verified. That was all I had. That was very quick, but yeah, we can maybe take some questions if there's something that's not clear, or there's somebody that has other questions to the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Perhaps if you move your presentation, then I have a better overview of who's asking question. So please raise your digital hand or pose a question. Can you remove the presentation, Christian?
Should I maximize this?
I think you just do it on the share screen, and there you can do it.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Anyway, thank you for the overview. I think we got a good overview of the EUDR requirements, but also your framework. And one thing I was thinking about, like when you work with the supply chain approach, I guess one of the challenges is the consistency of data that you can get throughout the supply chain. What are your experiences, especially if you work with supply chains in the global south? How easy or difficult is it to get data of acceptable quality throughout the value chain?
Yeah, that's a good question. One requirement, and I didn't mention that specifically, is actually that operators will have to know the origin data of their products to the plots of land that have contributed to a specific product or batch of commodities that are placed on the EU market. So this is a whole new level of challenge for the supply chains. So that means that you will, if you import cocoa for making chocolate, if you're a European chocolate manufacturer, you import cocoa, you will have to know the plots of land that have contributed to that cocoa, the raw material. And obviously this level of data is extremely difficult to get, and it has always been a challenge, you know, even within the established certification systems like Rainforest Alliance, Agriculture Standard, or the FSC for Forest Management Certification. It's always been a big challenge to implement consistent systems where the data on the origin or other attributes of the product is transferred consistently downstream in the supply chain. So this is, you know, I do not know how the EU operators will actually manage to meet this challenge in the future. Obviously, some of the very big companies are already doing a lot of this themselves, but they are obviously the ones that are that have resources and capacity to do this kind of things. The challenge will be much harder for small and medium-sized enterprises, at all different levels in the supply chains. So I see a huge challenge here in the commodity sector that is engaged with these specific commodities to meet this data requirement. It's going to be very, very difficult. So I don't have a solution. I can just say that the challenge is just getting a lot bigger with these new requirements, and they will. To me, if this is going to function as the way it's written in the regulation, it will dramatically change the way that supply chain data have to be transferred and created in this agriculture sectors compared to what we see now.
And I guess also if you're talking about small and medium-sized companies, the cost burden of actually getting those data will be relatively high. Do you see but I guess it also creates opportunities, especially within digital solutions. Do you see company providing digital solutions where you can get more reliable data through those mechanisms?
Yeah, sure. This is already something we see coming. I mean, we have had many discussions and talks with both like GIS-based companies that provide GIS or spatial analysis of GIS or satellite imagery to evaluate risks of deforestation, for example, but also companies that have a more database like solutions, for example, blockchain-based traceability solutions where data can be transferred through the supply chain. The challenge, of course, is to have processes and systems that can collaborate with each other at different steps in the supply chain and can be consistently implemented. But it will require, especially for small-scale manufacturers or small-scale producers or land users, that somebody support or at least organize group formation or a combined approach to say, let's try to get this data for this big group of farmers in an area. So it will not only be the individual household farmer or small scale farmer that is responsible for these systems. So, but a big challenge for sure.
Okay, and I guess most companies and people who are present here agree that it's an important thing to create this transparency. When you listen to the companies, what do they say? Because I guess they see the rationale behind it, but they also see it as a cost burden. What do you hear from their side?
There's a lot of how do you say it? It's like they cannot believe their own eyes when they read the text and hear, or their ears when they hear the actual requirements of this regulation, because it's so demanding, especially this requirement for geolocation. There is a requirement in the regulation that if you import cocoa, you need to understand the geolocation of the plots of lands that have contributed to that batch of cocoa. And this, I think they are still trying to figure out where to stand on this. It's so it's going to be a big challenge, this one, but but also, I mean, if you have been in the wood product sector for some years, you will know the EU timber regulation, which also had comparable requirements for due diligence and for the legality of timber. So there is a certain understanding of the approach that's being taken for this new deforestation regulation, but the level of detail of the data that's required is new and something that I think the industry is still getting used to understanding and interpreting and trying to understand how that would be possible in their specific sector.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Kain.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Christian. Very interesting. And as you say, it's really very comprehensive. And I'm just wondering, I mean, if you're saying that it's, you know, it's every product that is using these products also. So I'm just wondering, does this also go for all the many products that's containing palm oil? I mean, because then, I mean, that must be a really monstrous then process that you are starting. And then I was wondering also whether you see in the future that they will actually extend the number of commodities, because, you know, I guess, you know, what is it, 8 commodities, but, you know, I could imagine that maybe it would, you know, increase the number of commodities in the future. So just your vision for how it's going to look.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. And yes, it does, or the regulation includes an annex where there is, you know, it's based on the customs codes, the EU common, what's it called, common nomenclature. I think they call it of custom codes and customs definitions. And you have, for example, for palm oil, as you mentioned, that's a good example of a very complex commodity, because it's being used in it has many derivative forms, but it includes, like, of course, the palm nuts and kernels, but also the crude palm oil, but also like palmitic acid, stearic acid, and salt and esters of those, saturated acidic, you know, all kinds of chemical derivatives of palm oil that is found in so many food products and cosmetics and other types of products where palm oil derivatives are used. So yes, it will be just for the palm oil, the sector that will be affected by this is huge. And your last question was on the expectation for an expansion of the scope of commodities. Yes, I mean, within the first year, I think, of the implementation, the Commission will contract a study, and there will be studies, and there will be, you know, negotiations on whether or not to include other types of commodities. I mean, that was at some point during the development of this current version, there was mentions of poultry and goats, and I think another livestock also to be included. And obviously there could be scope for including other type of agricultural commodities as well, maybe like rice, say, or, you know, bananas.
I'm thinking, Christian, and also based on the question that you raised, Kain, when you have these complex products that includes a lot of different components, and you work with it within a supply chain, how do you decide who actually has the responsibility for generating the different data that is required? Because I guess a lot of the data will travel throughout the value chain, but somebody has to produce it, and these would be different actors or different companies. I could easily imagine an argument arising: who has the responsibility for generating the different type of data that is required?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point, because the data sharing in the supply chain will be very important for the ability to meet these requirements. You know, in the regulation text, it's very clear that those who place on the EU market this commodity or product, which is covered by the regulation, on the market for the first time, they have the responsibility, at least the legal responsibility. But let's say you buy a product that comes out of a supply chain from Indonesia, for example, or from an African country, and you're European, you know, you have to, in some way, delegate some responsibility into your supply chain to make sure that it's the correct data that's available. I mean, it's much easier for those who is packaging a raw material close to the area of production or close to the farm. It's much easier for them to have access to the relevant origin data than it is for somebody sitting in an office in Copenhagen, right? So it is, you know, legally it will be the responsibility of related to the EU deforestation regulation. It would be the responsibility of the importer or the operator. But that being said, I think that the responsibility should be delegated upstream into the supply chain to be closer to the origin of the product. I mean, it has to, otherwise it will not be possible. I mean, for example, this very detailed data on geolocation will have to be created almost on site for every farm or plot of land, and then in some way managed through the supply chain to the EU market.
So, Karen, you're muted. You're muted.
All right. No, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. You know, I'm just wondering whether this, I mean, if it's really going to be implemented and actually being controlled and everything, I mean, it's huge. Doesn't it do they not foresee, or do we not foresee, or you foresee that it will actually impact and maybe reduce imports and exports, which of course from a climate maybe perspective is not a bad thing, but I mean from a business perspective, maybe it's not such a great thing. So I'm just wondering, because it's going to be, you know, these requirements, it will be easier within your own vicinity or in areas like Europe or the US where you know where there are more controls than from an African country or Asia. I'm just wondering, and I mean already now we see the supply chains moving closer to ourselves and to Europe. So is this not just going to be another addition that's going to contribute to that kind of development? And I'm not saying it's necessarily bad. I'm just, wondering.
Yeah, I mean that is true. I think to a certain degree, at least for the commodities that can be grown. You know, there is no coffee or cocoa in Europe, but or palm oil, or rubber. But for soy, for example, cattle, timber, obviously, or timber species that can be grown, then there is a certain risk of that it will favor you know, markets that are seen to have less risk of deforestation and less risk of legal non-compliance. Another thing that will probably, and unfortunately, I think this is also an important thing, is that it will favor larger companies, especially in producer countries like our countries in Africa. It will favor those larger companies that have more capacity and more resources to actually provide this kind of data. And it would disfavor small and medium-sized enterprises, both as producers but also manufacturers that have less access to the markets. So they are, you know, the risk is that they are being pushed. They can be pushed out of the supply chain, at least those supply chains go into Europe. And this again could have like this, what do you call it, the effect of driving, you know, all the products that do not meet these requirements, driving them just to the Indian and Chinese markets where the requirements are, you know, not as strict. So that could mean like a shift in the way that, you know, so a shift towards, because, you know, the Chinese markets, I mean, they are the biggest soy importer in the world, and they do not have these strict requirements. So they'll probably just buy the stuff that is not verifiable against these rules. But I mean, again, it's kind of EU leading the way in a bit. I mean, I'm not saying that all the results will be positive, but it will set the bar for, you know, legal and non-deforestation, I think, worthwhile, you know, objective. But there are these potential negative feedback mechanisms that that could happen.
I think it's a very important point that you raised there, Christian, about the burden of complying. And I think there's evidence from other industries that are heavily regulated that the entrance barrier is just being increased by these regulations, and you end up with large industry players dominating a sector, which of course is not good for our members.
No, but this is where like a group type, and this is where certification could be an important tool for meeting these requirements, because most certification schemes have different types of group or multi-site management rules, where let's say you are a palm oil producer and you buy from many small scale farmers that have their plots. If you can arrange them in a group scheme where you know where they are, you know who they are, that would benefit them, as well as allowing them easier access to the market. So this is to be one of the solutions to this, is that companies downstream may take more responsibility to help the farmers, small and medium-sized farmers, to meet this type of market requirements.
Okay, Christian, we are approaching the end. Just one question before we get there. So in Preferred by Nature, you've developed the framework, but do you also provide assistance? Do you work as consultants in implementing these frameworks?
Yeah, I mean, our framework is that's a full sustainability framework, right? It goes beyond the EU deforestation regulation, but we have aligned our framework with the regulation in terms of the definition of legality, the definition of deforestation, the definition of due diligence, so that we would say that if you met all the requirements in our sustainability framework, you would meet the EU deforestation regulation and beyond. But to answer more directly your question, yes, I mean, we do provide advisory services as well as verification services. It's two different parts of our organization, more or less. But we have a division that works with more like advising companies to help them understand, or be more of a partner with an organization and help them, rather than just coming out with a checklist and verifying what they are doing. Then we are working with them to actually figure out how to do things. So yes.
So one quick last question from Olav.
Yes, Christian, thank you very much for this interesting points. Of course, it's not new for developing countries that they have to meet some severe criteria for exporting their products. But I wondered if you, related to your work, have some cases where you can show us and where you have gone into how they actually try to organize to get all these data to support the requirements. It could be helpful to have some concrete cases where we can see how they try to organize, and if that organization is acceptable. I was thinking that the new phenomenon or the increasing phenomenon of block farming would be a more organized way of production in agriculture in developing countries, and that could also be a platform for organizing these data so that they can live up to the criteria.
Yeah, thanks for that. The short answer is no. We have not really, the regulation has not yet been implemented, so we are still waiting for the final version to be published. So we have not actually worked with practical examples of trying to meet it yet, since it's not been finalized. But that will happen over the next. What we are doing, I mean, we are working with, and this again, it's mostly large-scale companies that come to us now and say, we know about this regulation, we want to be ready, help us with evaluating our supply chains. So the primary activities that we see now is that big companies that operate and import into the EU market is getting ready, trying to understand and verify the supply chains. I mean, we have worked with large chocolate manufacturer in Europe, for example, that wants to understand, what is their liability, how do they address this supply chain information challenges that they have for all the cocoa that they are importing. We have worked not directly with this, since this is such a new requirement, but we are working, for example, in Ghana, I think with the cocoa producers to organize, not from creating this data, it's more like a management project, a development project. But this is, of course, a type of projects that can, in the future, include this type of data collection as well, since that will be necessary to have market access in Europe.
Okay, Christian, thank you very much for taking the time to share your insights. It has been...
Thank you for joining. Thanks for the invitation.
Highly interesting. For July, that's the summer break, so we don't have A2i talks there, but our next talk will be in August, and we'll be back with the topic. But once again, Christian, thank you. I'm sure we'll be in contact whenever we meet companies that have to comply to these new regulations, but thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Bye.